let's see.
Yeah,
So Alexis, were you just simply inspired by what the Haas movement is doing and decided your organization would benefit from the, potential of implementing some change?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, as I'm sure everybody's talked about, and I've heard you say, the don't waste a crisis. We, we already always wanted to do these kinds of things, but from a capacity standpoint, we were always sort of hitting that wall of living in a reactive world because of overpopulation in the shelter. And so to have just even that pause button of us, me having even a couple of remote days, like I'm worked from home today. So what did that mean? Instead of that sort of constant people coming to me about things, I have dedicated time to sit and work on proactive plans and things like that. So it was really about having some capacity to do this, and then having an environment in animal welfare where everybody's talking about it, right? So like this is what all the webinars are and all the town halls. And so it's hard to not tune into the weekly Maddie's leadership call and stuff and say, I'm not going to try that. Like it's what's happening and it's what's out there to learn. And we've really pretty much the entire time that, we've been doing this. It's 6 o'clock, so we can get started and talk about this some more. So
okay,
that'll work. Okay. So, hello to folks who are joining us. Whoever is on the line, welcome, and thank you for being a part of this virtual town hall. If there are some technical difficulties, please bear with us. We have been working diligently to figure out this GoToWebinar stuff and everything like that. So bear with us, but we're going to try to keep it on point. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Alexis Pugh, and I am the director of Memphis Animal Services here in Memphis, Tennessee. I have been in this role since 2016 when Mayor Strickland took office. And I am very honored today to have a special guest who I invited to be a part of this conversation, and that is Gina Knepp, who you see in the other screen next to me. Gina's full-time job is as National Shelter Engagement Director for Found Animals Foundation. Is that right, Gina? Did I say that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And then she has also taken on another fantastic role, being a part of the executive committee for the HAAS Working Group Program. HAAS stands for Human Animal Support Services. And it's sort of a guiding principle of how we as shelters can change moving forward to be more effective at our work. And it's working really hard to sort of build programming models. There's pilot shelters happening all around the country that are trying different things. Basically, it's a really intensive thought process group that I think is going to really be the leading force for us moving forward in animal welfare. So Gina, thank you for joining me here tonight. I think that the knowledge and wisdom that you bring is going to be so valuable for our attendees. And Gina, I would just like to kick it off by kind of turning it over to you. And could you talk a little bit more about your professional experience and about what you're doing with HAAS before we kind of roll through some of the specifics for Memphis?
Absolutely. So a year ago, last week, as a matter of fact, I retired from the Front Street Animal Shelter. I was managing the municipal government shelter for the city of Sacramento, and I did that for about 9 years. I had a long career at the city, but the last leg of it was animal welfare. I always say it was the best, worst job I ever had in my life. Prior to that, I was in the call center industry. I had no animal welfare experience, and the city asked me to help them out. And I fell in love with it, and that's where I landed at the end of my career. I went to work for Michelson Found Animals last year, probably 3 days after I retired part-time, and my sole focus is increasing the number of animals that are reunited with their owners, either before they come to the shelter or once they've made it to the shelter. That was never really a topic that was given a lot of attention, and fortunately now, especially through the HAAS efforts, that's a big deal. And I think it's one of the most important things we can be doing to increase life saving. And I'm sure we're going to touch on that. I do sit on the executive team for the Human Animal Support Services Project. And I'm also on the board for the California Animal Welfare Association, which primarily does training and legislation in California. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gina, because truly, I think that one of the things that I've learned in some of these Haas town halls and working groups is that animal welfare traditionally has just been so siloed in its approach. And there's been this sort of, well, my community is different mindset. And what we're finding, the more we all kind of go to these conferences and do these working groups together, is that the similarities from community to community are far greater than the differences. And so what does that mean for us? Well, it means that we don't all have to sit around and reinvent the wheel all day, which is great news for people who are already busy doing the work they're doing. So the fact that there are national organizations supporting us and creating these great programs that we can replicate in our communities, knowing that they have proven success, is really a big win. And so that's what brings us to what we're doing here in Memphis today, for those of you who are watching. So we sent out some materials for you to review in advance, but we know you're all busy people. So we want to kind of go through it and talk a little bit more in depth about some of the sort of core guiding principles of community supported sheltering. And that way Gina can throw in her 2 cents along the way as being one of the leaders in this movement across the country. So my friend Katie, who is not visible on screen, will be advancing slides for me. So I will say next slide to Katie and we can get started. There we go. So what does this community supported sheltering model mean? I think it's critically important that we understand that this is not taking away our traditional animal control functions. That is something that we will always be tasked with doing. Public safety is a core part of what we are at ordinance level charged with doing. So those traditional animal control functions are going to continue, but it's combining it with community supported sheltering. And there's a lot of reasons why we want to do this. And the most important reason being is that traditional animal control, when we use one solution to solve every kind of problem, we are not solving the problems in the most effective, most efficient, or most cost-friendly way. We're basically throwing a more expensive, more difficult solution at a problem many times than needs to be there. And the great equivalent to this that I think a lot of people can understand is the idea of human health and the emergency room. So if you get a paper cut, do you need to go by ambulance to the emergency room? You do not, unless maybe you have an underlying health condition or there's something greater happening there. So human health has addressed that and is starting to look at alternatives to having everyone funnel through the ER. Well, can't we look at that as a similar analogy in animal welfare? The idea that a friendly, healthy puppy that people are going to just fight over to adopt, and the person who picked it up and found it is willing to keep that pet in their home and try to locate an owner or find a new owner. Why on earth would we take up the valuable kennel space and resources in the shelter when we can support that person through the process at a much lower cost without putting pets at risk for euthanasia? And maybe most importantly, that's so much better for the dog. Puppies being in the shelter are exposed to disease, kennel stress. It's just not an ideal environment. So we're solving a whole bunch of problems by looking at alternate solutions that are better for people and better for pets. Any other thoughts kind of on that big picture idea in front of you there, Gina?
Well, I think that people are good. Most people are good. And whether we like it or not, whether we know it or not, people have been finding and helping animals without us forever, without our involvement, right? We could never possibly handle all of the lost or stray animals in our community. I mean, we need to be realistic about that. And I think it's just high time that we had a partnership with our community and let them help us. I mean, they pay the taxes, right? Let them help us drive the money appropriately so it serves the most animals and serves the most people. Personally, it's the most exciting thing I think that's happened in animal welfare in the last 100 years. And I'll let you go on because I could preach all day long about it, but it's time for us to kind of hold hands with our community and work together.
Yep. Katie, if you could advance the slide, please. So, like we just said, it supports that human-animal bond. We're keeping pets with their families. And so that means pet parents get help to keep their pet through a myriad of support and resources. But it also talks about pet finders. And this really goes to the heart of what Gina just talked about. So what Gina just said is, trust people. And too often there's been this disconnect in animal welfare. I mean, you know, how many times would people say, I want to work here because I like animals better than people? Well, it's a flawed premise, because we are in a people business. And the fact is we need to trust that a person who pulls their car off on the side of the road and picks up an animal that they don't know and takes it into their custody has a good heart and can be trusted to do the right thing. And that's what this is about. It's about engaging that person, knowing that they already have a vested interest in saving animals because they just physically did it on their own. And this is something that I really want Gina to dig into in a minute, is that if we keep that pet in the neighborhood where it was found, we exponentially increase the chances that it gets back home. And I think that there's some flawed thinking out there that all of these free roaming dogs are unowned pets that don't have a home. And what data and research around the country and here locally is telling us is that the vast, vast, vast majority of these animals are actually owned. Katie, you can go on. Again, helps keep pets out of the shelter unless they absolutely need to be there. You can advance the slide again. So let's get into the nitty gritty, right? So what we know is that we've been tracking for years now the reasons that owners contact us to surrender, because how can you solve a problem if you don't know what the problem is? And we've long done certain kind of low-hanging fruit things, like provided assistance with food and things like that. But the time is now, and what we've been focused on is we've got to ramp up that sort of arsenal of resources. So one of the main things that we found, and Gina, I'd be curious to hear from your perspective if this sort of parallels nationally what you're hearing. But here in Memphis, one of the main reasons that we get a request for a surrender of a pet has to do with housing instability. More so than behavior or spay neuter or anything like that. It is that someone is moving, has moved, where they're moving to doesn't accept pets, they can't afford the pet deposit or things like that. And so these new services now here in Memphis, based on our data that we have tracked, we'll pay people's pet deposits. We got a grant to do it. We will provide temporary boarding if someone needs help during that transition. What can we do to help you find pet-friendly housing if we can intervene early enough in the process before you've selected a place? We really think that that's going to be a huge segment that we can start digging into now that we actually have the resources at our disposal to address those problems. Gina, would you say that that lines up with what's happening around the country as well?
I would agree with that. You know, at Michelson Found Animals and HABRI, which is the Human Animal Bond Research Institute, did a big study about housing and pet-friendly housing and what the barriers are out there. You know, a lot of landlords will say, I'm pet-friendly, but it can only be a 10-pound Chihuahua, or,
Right.
you know, there's all these rules and there's all these costs. And, you know, everything you said is so true. I don't know if anybody in the audience is thinking about this right now, but I think it needs to be said. You know, if there's this notion that if somebody can't afford a pet, they shouldn't have one. And I think I want to just throw that out there. Who are we to say that someone in a lower income bracket doesn't deserve the love of an animal? And I think that's the premise that we need to launch off from. And whether we want them to have a pet or not, they're going to. So let's help them keep the pet that they love, that they know, that we can ensure is healthy. I mean, that's kind of the basis for all of this. Why would we want to tear people apart, right? But yeah, pet-friendly housing is a big issue. The cost of having a pet in a rental, but all the studies are showing that pet owners make better tenants than non-pet owners. They stay longer. They tend to take better care of their property because they don't want to lose that privilege. So I could go on and on about that, but you're spot on, Alexis, on everything that you've said.
Yeah, and I think I like the point that you made, because it is a myth, and I think it's fear-based thinking that is oftentimes perpetuated by people's social media feeds, right? So we have an exposure bias, like who we choose to follow, what we choose to see. Well, Well, unfortunately, a lot of what has sort of permeated social media, in my experience, related to animal welfare. So if you're an animal person and you're on social media, a lot of it is sad. A lot of it is the bad stuff. A lot of it is the horrible cruelty case. And it gives a skewed perspective on what reality is, and that those are the exceptions. They are not the rule. And I heard a great analogy, or sort of a great thinking question, when I was at the Best Friends Conference, I think last year. And James Evans and Kenny Lombardi were presenting. James Evans, if y'all don't know who that is, check out his organization, CARE. He's focusing heavily on the idea of inclusion and diversity within animal welfare as being the key to life saving. And Kenny Lombardi does grassroots advocacy for Best Friends. And they brought up this great point that hits exactly to what you said, Gina. We have so traditionally associated quality of pet ownership with the wealth of the pet owner, and that money equals quality. And they gave me this great example. They said, let's take a dog that maybe lives in a low income neighborhood and maybe doesn't eat great food, eats the cheap stuff, and maybe lives outside in a doghouse, and maybe doesn't get, those annual vet visits that we all, talk about all the time. But there's people home all day, and they're constantly out playing with the kids, and there's always somebody there, and this dog gets to live this full active life. Is that dog more neglected? Or what about the dog whose mom is very wealthy and it's a little Maltese and she summers in Europe for 6 months or 6 weeks, and the dog sits in a kennel at PetSmart? I don't know. I think that's a decision we all have to make for ourselves. But I think for us to just so blanket say it's money or neglect, and that those are our only two options, doesn't factor in all of those specific intricacies of what makes a dog happy. And I'll tell you, my dogs have access to a dog door, and there were many times I asked my most recent dog that passed away, Eveline, I was like, Evie, come inside. Like, what are you doing? And she wanted to lay outside. So I think we so anthropomorphize these animals and try to associate human values, and it doesn't give the whole picture of what quality of life looks like for a pet. So it's changing our perceptions, and that's hard. I think that's hard for a lot of people to do. Next slide, Kate. So we talked about frequently asked questions in that document. Go ahead, Katie. This is a big one we're getting a lot, Gina, and I'm curious from your perspective, just, kind of at the national level. So I think there's been a lot of confusion, and this is one of the things we're trying to do better, is better differentiate that there is an emergency intake response plan that went into effect really across the country at the recommendation of the National Animal Care and Control Association, that we went into emergency intake. This was, stay-at-home orders. This was unknown future. This was something that we did to protect staff safety, to be able to, reduce the number of people in our building, because there were so many unknowns early on. But what we're talking about here is something we started really implementing because it gave us another tool to use when shelter intake wasn't available. But the tool stays, not the emergency intake. I would love to get sort of your thoughts, because I think, honestly, Gina, this is probably the biggest kind of hang-up question we get from the community, saying, emergency intake, you're just leaving animals to die on the streets and get hit by cars and all of that. So I'm sure you've heard some of that in your world. Could you talk a little bit about this point, COVID response versus this plan long-term?
Yeah, I will say that I think COVID is the best thing that ever happened to our industry, 100%. It made us kind of totally rejigger everything that we do, and America responded, right? Animals went into foster homes in the thousands, and in the thousands. The waiting lists for adoptions have never been longer in the history of animal welfare in our country. I think that moving forward, what we need to do is take the lessons that we learned from this incident and what made it better for animals. To me, if my animal were lost, I would much prefer that my blind, deaf dog, who's laying on the couch right now, be in someone's home on their couch until we could be reunited, instead of a concrete stainless steel cage, which is what most shelters look like, right? and receiving love, and whether it's love from a stranger, but it's not the scariness of a shelter, no matter how hard we try to make our shelters amazing. If we don't learn from this opportunity, we will have failed miserably. I think we're realizing people need help. We're in the midst of food insecurity, housing insecurity, unemployment. There's just a lot of stress right now around the election and everything that's happening. To waste this moment of learning on how we could do better. There are animals that have to be in our shelter. They just do. Whether they've bitten someone or they're abuse neglect case, and even some of those should be in foster. But let's reserve rooms at the shelter for those animals that really, really need to be there and can't go into foster, so that we can devote more time and energy to helping them, whether it's through healing or behavior or medical intervention. And let's let the ones that are someone else's pets that are lost, let them be in a safe home until we can reunite them with their families. Because it's over 90% of the dogs, I can't speak to the cats, but 90% of the dogs that are brought into shelters have a family. They have a name and a home and a couch and people that love them. So let's, I guess, our focus be, how do we get them back? And how do we not burden our shelters in such a way that they're a hotbed of, disease and wasted government dollars? Let's spend those dollars doing good work.
And something that Gina just said that those of you watching may go, what? What'd she say? Over 90% of owned pets? What she's referring to, as I alluded to right at the beginning, there's some amazing studies that have been done out there at shelters around the country. And in fact, Gina's organization connected me with one of those studies that we are efforting to have replicated here in Memphis. And I'm working with the mayor's innovation team and our performance management department to see if we can't get a study like this done, maybe through the University of Memphis or something like that. But I have all the study methodology, and it's fascinating. The one I read was done in San Antonio, where they basically had a team of volunteers go out into neighborhoods, and they gave them some criteria of how you could identify a dog that's free roaming versus a dog that truly is homeless. So things to look for, like, does it appear to be of a good, healthy body weight? How does its coat condition look? Does it have any sign of a tag or ownership on it, a collar? How does it react around people? And they were given quadrants, and there's a whole bunch of research methodology that's certainly above my head, but this study allowed them to determine, with what they indicated was like a 95% degree of accuracy, that of the 34,000 dogs in San Antonio that may be free roaming at any given time, 87 to 96% of them were owned pets, not stray homeless animals. And man, if that didn't knock me over with a feather, I was blown away by that high of a number. But what it's really done is it has convinced me that if we can replicate that study here, and the data shows the same thing in Memphis, and then I pair that with this study we're currently doing about bites, where we've dug through every single bite call in our community, and we've looked at, was it an owned pet? Where did the bite happen? Did it happen on their property? Was the pet running loose? What was the severity of the bite? Who did they bite? And we're doing this super deep data dive, and we're finishing it this week, and then we're going to do some analysis on it. What we're finding already, just looking at it, is that, again, overwhelming majority are owned pets that are allowed to run loose and bite. So if we conduct that other study and find similar results about free roaming dogs, if we conduct this or get the results of this bite study, which it's already kind of showing us what we're thinking about that, what does that tell us? That the idea of running around and trying to pinpoint at some specific moment in time when a dog may be running loose is not the most efficient solution. The most efficient solution is focusing on those owners who are allowing this to happen. Because if I take their dog and bring it to the shelter, I've now moved it out of their neighborhood where they may not have transportation to get it. They may be fearful of coming to a government facility. They may not have access to the funds to reclaim, or they may just not even know how that process works. But what is likely? That they'll get another pet, and then they will have the same pattern of law-breaking behavior. And we've done nothing to fix the problem. We've taken a dog. We had to find another dog a home. So it's this whole, we've basically made more work for ourselves instead of addressing the systemic root cause of the problem, which is owner irresponsibility. So it's about shifting our focus to where we can have the biggest impact, which is working with owners. Go ahead and switch to the next one, please, Katie.
You know, Alexis, something that you keep harping on, and I say harping in a very positive way, is that the decisions we're making and the changes we're making are rooted in data, in scientific data, not what we think or what people feel, but true substantiated research and data, which I think the science is what we should be looking at, and not our emotions. So.
Absolutely. And that's exactly to the point on the screen right now. What's wrong with the way we've always done it? Well, what's wrong with the way we've always done it is we did it that way and it didn't fix the problem. So, I mean, what do they say? That's the definition of insanity, is you keep doing the same thing, expecting a different result. The example I use here, Gina, is one zip code 38127, which is a community here called Fraser. It's part of the city of Memphis. It has been our highest intake zip code forever. It's still our highest intake zip code. So what does that tell us? Our efforts at pulling more dogs out of Fraser than anywhere else has caused no reduction in the need to pull more dogs out of Fraser than anywhere else. I mean, so this continued pattern of bailing out the water instead of turning off the faucet is just an inefficient solution to the problem. And so you can see here on the screen, we did all this extra work, take them in, bring them in, care for them, have all these people do all this, can rescue take them, can adopters, now we got to do this. Oh, well, if we can't get enough of those people, we got to euthanize them. We just basically, we're doing the most difficult path to get to a solution. And it's sort of like, I look at it kind of like a V, right? So look at it like, here's the community and here's the shelter. We were going like this: take them out of the community, bring them to the shelter. Now they're at the shelter, we got to get them back out into the community. Well, why don't we just stay up here? It's a lot shorter. It's a direct line. Why are we adding a turn? So,
you know what? Well, 100%. And I'm working with a researcher who's done a really deep dive in Dallas, looking at their high intake areas and RTO rates. Dallas is doing great work with RTO. They still have more to do, but what we're finding is, of all the stray animals that came out of their Fraser, okay, that end up having to go up for adoption, only 5% of their strays were being adopted by the Fraser community. So that tells me that those folks who lost a pet for whatever reason did not reclaim, or we couldn't reclaim their animal, they're getting another one. And where are they getting them? Craigslist, backyard breeders, people in a parking lot selling puppies, and all those animals aren't fixed, chipped, vaccinated, and all those things. So let's, like you said, stop the V and go to Fraser. And Fraser's gonna be my word from now on, but let's go into Fraser and let's help people keep their pets, so that we don't have this vicious cycle of essentially recycling animals. That's what we're doing.
Yep, absolutely. All right, Katie, next slide, please. So we'll breeze through this pretty quickly because we've kind of hit on this. Who does it help? In our opinion, it helps everybody. It helps the pets because we haven't put them all under that one size fits all approach. It helps the pet parents who, there is a flawed premise that people think, in my opinion, that people think that the person who calls the municipal kill shelter to surrender their pet should immediately have said pet ripped from them because they're a horrible human being. That is the privilege that we assign because we know alternatives. We know other things. And to think that every member of your community knows all of those solutions. I say it all the time. Somebody taught me to spay and neuter. I mean, was it Bob Barker? Maybe, but somebody along the way said, spay and neuter. Somebody along the way told me, adopt, don't shop. I learned these things from someone in my life. So how unfair is it of us to hold people in communities to the same standard of knowledge when they may have never been exposed to that piece of knowledge? If their parents didn't teach them that, if they didn't learn that, how can we possibly expect them to know that there are alternatives to the shelter? Well, you know how we expect them to know? We tell them. That's our job, is we have to be the people who say there is an alternative to shelter surrender and not judge someone for seeking out that resource. Katie, you can go to the next one. This is the big one, Gina. Gosh, if I've heard it once, I've heard it 100 times. And again, I think it's some of that COVID confusion. You know, we are still in COVID response. And I think it's important for people to understand, like, I'm still doing split teams. I had two positives in my vet clinic. If I had not split up my 2 vets in my team, that would have been two-week periods where we would have had no vet care. So workforce continuity is critically important. Workforce safety, to make sure we're not the root of workplace transmission. I do not want our staff to get sick because of a COVID case at work. And then of course our citizens too. So we still have to keep ourselves kind of at a lower level from a population standpoint. But this is not about us not picking up strays anymore. What this is about is saying,
I'm so sorry.
Oh no, you have dogs? I think we're all shocked.
Yes. Hold on.
Sure. I think this is about saying to our community that we owe it to these animals to do a little bit more legwork, a little bit more investigation, a little bit more conversation before we just put the animal on the truck and bring it to the shelter. And I had a great analogy given to me the other day. It's sort of like if you were filtering gravel. I wasn't really familiar with filtering gravel, but someone who works for me was. And she just said, you know, you're going to get the big chunks out up here. So if the dog has a microchip, you know, and we can bring it right back to the owner, that's a pretty big chunk. But there's all these filters in between. And we used to, as animal control, just dump it all in the bucket. Well, now we're sort of filtering the gravel out, but there's still going to be pieces that fall through. And that's the key here, is if the intervention strategies don't work, we are still there. And we're always the first option for a public safety risk or a medical case. But the other ones, don't we owe it to ourselves to try and see if there's an alternative before we resort to the shelter? And so that's really the point here, is that we're the emergency room and we're a community resource hub. And all the stuff in between, we're just going to try, because if we can get that intake down just enough where we never have to euthanize for space again, I think that that's something that our entire community has been asking for and wants to see. Gina, thoughts?
I like that gravel analogy. It's perfect. Yeah. You know, if is your shelter 100% empty?
Nope. Not even.
You must be taking in strays, right?
Yeah.
But,
yeah.
And I said this earlier, there are so many people that have been finding lost animals and reuniting them with their families without our intervention forever. The average person actually has a much higher success rate of getting that animal back home to its family than we do. And I think that having those conversations with people that want to help, let the helpers help, and giving them the tools and support they need. Most dogs are 1,000 feet from home. Why would we want to drive a friendly, healthy, stray dog 10, 20, 30 miles? I have examples in Southern California where it's an hour drive to the shelter, an hour. Those pet parents, especially if they don't have transportation or means or whatever, will never see their dogs again, ever. So this, you know, fear drives everything, unfortunately. And I think people like to, we do it by human nature. We glom onto the things that are scary. And no, injured animals, dangerous animals, they have to go to the shelter. There's a place for them. But that friendly, like my dog who was just barking, if someone found him, I would hope that they would try to get him back to me before getting him to an animal shelter. That would be my hope.
Absolutely. And you just touched on something, and I think this is a really important point that you made. You were talking about those increased reunification chances if a dog stays close to home. And I hadn't heard that 1,000-foot statistic before, but that's really powerful when you say that. But one of the studies that I read that was done was the pet reunification study done in Austin. And where it talked about their return to owner rate in the shelter. They had a pretty good shelter return to owner rate for dogs of around 20%. which is about double what ours is. We're at about 10% in the shelter. But when they kept pets in the community where they were found, that return to owner rate for dogs went up to like 54%. It was pretty shocking. But what I would like to hear from you on that, if you can speak to it, is when we have shared that with people in our community, what I hear back is, we ain't Austin. We aren't Austin. Austin has a higher average cost of living. Austin has a lower poverty rate. Austin, and always looking for these disparities. You work nationally across the country. Can you dispel that myth that Austin shouldn't be something that we example ourselves after, or any of these other communities that have seen that same data?
Well, I've been to Austin and I've been to Memphis, and I'll take Memphis any day over Austin. Don't tell the Austinites that. I don't think socioeconomics have anything to do with it. People love animals. People want to help animals. It doesn't matter if you're rich or you're poor. It doesn't matter if you're Republican or Democrat. It doesn't. If you love animals and you find one, you will do the right thing regardless of where you live. It's something that's within us. And I think that your community has all the capabilities to outdo Austin. And maybe we should flip it and let's see how much better you can do. I am so sorry. I don't know where my husband went. My dog just running around barking.
No, it's actually not that loud. You are fine. We can hear you great.
Good. I just, it's easy to make excuses because that's human nature, right? Yeah. But let's really look at the socioeconomics of your community, and maybe we should do some research and compare the poverty rates. Hold on a second. Sorry, it's okay. Yelling at my husband now. But people like to say we can't do this because of X. Maybe Alexis, you and I can do some comparison. And I bet you that we will all be pleasantly surprised. The national return to owner rate percentage in the country is about 22%. Dallas, which is doing really well, they're only at 37%. So, and I'd be happy to do a specialized session just for your shelter staff and volunteers on how your city can increase the return to owner rate, because it can absolutely be done.
Yep, and that's something we're absolutely wanting to do and engage with. Gina, you and I were talking, for everyone else's, ears to hear. We were talking ahead of time about how the more research I do, the more I realize that we need to seek grant funding for microchips. Now, Michelson Found Animal Foundation that Gina works for has an amazing, they're a nonprofit, so we're able to get microchips from them. That's who we use for the shelter at an extremely affordable price. It includes free lifetime updates and changes, which we know has a strong correlation to that chip actually tracking back to a person, because they didn't have to pay an annual fee to keep up their information. But we need to do a better job here, and this is a priority for me, to get those microchips saturated in our high intake zip codes. We have got to give folks access to free microchips, because that cost is going to be so much less than the cost of picking up their dog and bringing it to the shelter. And I'll tell you, it works. I mean, we had a great story yesterday where one of our officers, they all have those Halo microchip scanners in their vehicle, and he sent a picture in where you could read the number, and we typed it in the computer, and our customer care specialist was on the phone with that owner, and she was just crying and thrilled and said, I've been driving around for an hour. And so he drove right to her house, and that dog never stepped foot in the shelter. And the more situations, stories like that we can have because of a microchip, I think the better off we're going to be. But let's say it's not an officer with a microchip scanner. Let's say it's you as a citizen that picks up a pet. Well, one thing that we did that is really exciting is we got those microchip scanners placed at every fire station in our city, because that was the most pervasive location. So there's 58 fire stations around. So if any of you find a stray animal, you can always stop there, especially if it's after hours and a vet clinic's closed. You could always go to a fire station, because we know there's someone there 24 hours a day. And then what we'd like to offer you is to be a part of our Found Foster program. So it used to be, you find a stray dog, you come to the shelter, you wait in line at the intake door. There's a bunch of people there with dogs, you might be there for a while. Now what we're trying to do is say, if you will hang on to this pet, we'll do everything else. Everything, crate, food, vaccines, spay and neuter, heartworm preventative, flea preventative. We'll take pictures, we'll put it on our website, we'll market it, we'll get the adopter process. We will do literally everything that we do for animals in the shelter. We're just asking that it's physical location instead of like dog kennel B42, it's in like dog kennel Gina Knepp's living room. That's the kennel location. So, but it's the exact same process. It's just taking advantage of the fact that someone was caring enough and compassionate enough to pick up this dog in the first place. And then it goes back to all the things that Gina said. That was probably in their own neighborhood. So maybe they could take that dog for a walk. And, especially with COVID, people are out all the time. It's been nice weather. Do you know where this dog lives? Do you recognize this dog? I found this dog. Here's found posters, things like that. So there's all these strategies that are more effective if the pet is in a home with a finder than if the pet is sitting in a kennel at the shelter. Next slide, please.
I was thinking of something while you were talking. Americans, I don't know if this has been published yet, but and I believe I have the number right, Americans spent $100 billion last year on their animals. We are an animal loving society. There are more good people than bad people. So what you're describing about working with someone who finds an animal and giving them all the tools that they need and helping them facilitate the return, I mean, what a beautiful thing, right? And to anybody in the audience, wouldn't you want your animal to get home as quickly as humanly possible? That's what I would want for mine. So you're spot on. You're on the right track.
Yeah. And then, it goes right to this slide right here. Why can't we just do all those things? Because for anyone who's been around a shelter that has these massive intakes, those of you in the audience, I'm sure some of you, I know some of you are volunteers. You've been there, you've seen us. We're all hair on fire every day, right? Like before COVID, it was, oh, we have all these dogs in the ACO kennels. Oh my gosh, we got to move the dogs out of here. We got to clean these kennels. We got to get them out. We got to move them out because there's more dogs coming in. It was this constant state of emergency reactivity that never gave us a moment of time to breathe and say, is what we're doing actually fixing the problem? And so doing both, to a certain extent we are, and we will, and we can, but doing both doing the old way at the level we did does not get us to, we want to throw so much at this prevention method, right? We want to throw as much of our time and energy. And the way we do that is by cutting down the time that all that reactive save their lives from shelter euthanasia stuff does.
Alexis, and at the end of the day, don't we all want the same thing? Mm-hmm. More animals to live, right? To live wonderful lives with wonderful people. And if there's any objection to this new philosophy, I don't understand it, because at the end of the day, more animals will live. And that's the whole point.
Yep. Next slide, please, Katie. Okay, so as you can see, Michelson found animals right there on the list, but we just wanted to give folks a perspective. I think sometimes people think that I just, sit in my office and come up with crazy ideas, which I do sometimes, but this is not one of them. This is something that is happening broadly. In fact, I actually asked a question recently, and you can certainly speak to this. I asked, is there anybody not doing this? Is there anybody who isn't exploring and embracing this concept? And the answer I got was maybe like a couple rural small shelters, in certain areas. I heard maybe a few in North Carolina, things like that. But in large scale, this is happening at municipal shelters around the country. And it's 30 municipal shelters that are tier 1 and tier 2 pilot shelters for Haas, plus all these national organizations. And to me, one of the things I was tasked with when I got this job was get out of your silo, get out of MAS being the backward shelter, engage at the national level, bring in Target Zero, go to conferences, follow progressive sheltering practices. And that's what we've done every single day. We're always learning and listening. Bring in Dogs Playing for Life, go to this conference, bring in this idea, send people, staff to mentorships and apprenticeships and things like that. So why would we turn our back on this now when everybody who has risen in their field to these upper echelon levels. You know, they've succeeded enough in their jobs, maybe at a municipal shelter, to be elevated to these national leadership roles. And I'm going to turn my back on them and say, not for Memphis. That would be foolish.
It would be foolish. You know, there's over 500 individual people working on the Haas project and 190 different organizations, not just outside of the tier 1 and tier 2 shelters. I mean, we've really put our tentacles into areas, into industries beyond animal welfare. So it's very powerful. And you're right, this list on the screen now is a reflection of the heavy hitters in the animal welfare space in our country that are supporting this work. And there's some pretty brilliant minds on that list. And so I agree with you. Why would we turn our backs on an opportunity to transform? And you know what? It doesn't mean that everything we did was wrong. We did what we thought was right as we went along, right? Shelters started because of rabies control and dangerous animals. And we have to apply contemporary thinking to the work that we do. And animal welfare is a really niche industry. We're not very big, even though we really think we're big and important. But it's time for us to enter the 21st century. And I really do believe, I'm not getting paid to say this, I really do believe that this is, you know, animal sheltering 3.0. And it is going to be the thing that saves more lives and takes care of both ends of the leash, because it's about people and their animals.
I like that, both ends of the leash. Next slide, Katie. Okay, this is another big one, and you touched on this too, but this idea of, I mean, I literally think that I've had people be like, so what are your people doing now? Like, they're just making a paycheck and sitting around. And that couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, many of our animal services officers have told me they're working harder than ever before. And a big part of that is because their job is different and they're having to learn a brand new job that they've never had to do before. And so I would say that nobody's not working harder. We're working smarter. And there probably is an element of some work-life balance that was badly needed and was missing, especially for my leadership team before. Our supervisors were killing themselves. They were not maintaining an effective work-life balance despite my efforts to push them out the door. They just care too much and they couldn't put it down because there's one more life that they can save before they leave today. So this is not about us doing less. It's about us doing, you know, making the dollar go further. And if you look at our average cost to care for a pet at $309, well, I can spend $300, get somebody medical care for their dog. It never steps foot in the shelter. They're happy. Pet stays in its home. What a win. What a win. So, you know, I think that thinking that our taxpayer dollars are being wasted is literally the exact opposite of what's happening. We are being better stewards of our taxpayer dollars with this approach.
Yep. Couldn't agree with you more. It's a rejiggering of the budget. And I think we are better stewards of tax dollars. And the more we communicate the work that we're doing in this effort, I think more people will come to appreciate our conscientiousness when it comes to their tax dollars. It is their money. And I think this is the most, I don't know, I can't think of a really good word, the smartest way to manage animal sheltering. So super exciting
Katie,
times.
Okay, so this is one you touched on, and I think that this is important to say. There are some animals that are better off in the shelter, and we are not saying that we should keep them all with their families. You know, victims of cruelty and neglect, hoarding cases. In fact, throughout COVID, we've had at least 3 large hoarding cases that we've taken in. 2 of them were exclusively cats, about 40 to 50 cats. But we had one that was a multitude of animal breeds, from dogs to chickens to ducks to cats to rabbits to all of this in a small house, and there was like 40 of them. So we, even in our emergency intake response, we were still taking in those cases because it's the right thing to do and we'll never stop. But again, it's the point that if I take in a hoarding case, and I was still doing all the other stuff. What if I don't have room for them? And I have a great example of that. We took in, there was a rescue, that German Shepherd rescue, and she had 40 German Shepherds in a like 2-bedroom house in deplorable conditions. They were in feces up to their elbows in wire crates. It was horrible. And we went in and seized them all. That was in the summer, I think 2 summers ago now in June. And we didn't have kennels. We did not have room for 40 German Shepherds to come in. So we had to have, I mean, we had staff in there till 3 a.m. cleaning divided kennels. And, we don't put dogs on opposite sides of divided kennels. That dog humane housing is both sides. But we had no choice. We had to have dogs double-sided in these kennels to try to make room. We need to be aware that that kind of surge could happen. Just like hospitals have learned how important it is to have surge capacity in their ICUs and for intake, we need to be thinking about surge capacity as well, because these hoarding cases, these cruelty cases, these are the things that we are the only ones equipped with handling. And I think that that's what's so important that people need to understand. These are the cases you want in our 4 walls, but we need to have the capacity to address them and address them properly. So we do need help from the community for the cases that don't meet this threshold.
Yeah, and you know what? Something popped into my head while you were talking. We had a citizens advisory committee. I don't even know if that was the body that I was talking to, but when you don't have surge capacity and you're full all the time and a case like that occurs, there's a shelter in California right now that took in 80 Chihuahuas today, 80 into one shelter. My question, and this is rhetorical, but so who should die? Who do we kill to make room
Right.
at the end, right? And I don't want an answer, but think about that if you had to make that decision. So surge capacity is super important. So we don't have to do that. We shouldn't have to do that. And increasing our foster capacity and engaging help from the community is the way we're going to get to always have surge capacity, so that we're there for those that really need to be there. And we don't have to decide who lives and dies.
100%. Next slide, please, Katie. We'll breeze through this one. This is just this flawed premise where people think it's just going to make our numbers look better, and like that save rate. And, and you can speak to this. One of the big conversations happening at the national level is the save rate is still important, but should it be the only metric by which a shelter's success is defined? And I think what we're really focusing on, what's great is we're using a software called Shelter Love. For folks who don't know, we just switched to that recently, and they built out this entire community engagement community services portal where we can go in there, and just like an animal control call, we can track when we get someone's pet spayed and neutered, when we provide pet food pantry assistance, when we provide medical care. And so we're going to be able to really track that data and take a look at that information, which I think is going to help prove the case and the model that the work is still happening. It's just happening differently. But that save rate, it's probably not going to go up, because if you think about it, if you have 100 animals and 70 of them are easy and friendly to adopt out, and 30 of them are behavior or medical, then you've got a 70%. Well, if we took in 70 animals and all of them are dangerous or medical, and I'm probably not helping with my math analogy here, I should have started with 10. But point being, if the population you're taking in is less adoptable or less savable, so to speak, either medically or behaviorally, then your number's automatically going to go down. So it's quite the opposite of trying to make our numbers look better. It's about trying to do the right thing, regardless of what that number ends up looking like.
And you know what I think's been really interesting is the whole the language no kill or live release, or all of that has kind of become silent in this process. And it's more about, and I don't think the save rate is going to change dramatically. I really don't. If anything, we'll be helping animals stay at home with their people, where they're less likely to get euthanized. I mean, I referenced my blind deaf dog on the couch. If she ended up in an animal shelter, she probably wouldn't get adopted, right? But if I was that owner that needed that extra hand or that bag of food or whatever, she's going to live her life out. So there's a community save rate, and that's going to have further exploration. El Paso, Texas is really looking at their numbers that way. Community save and shelter save. So that's a whole other webinar.
Yeah. All right. We are running low on time, and we do have a question that we want to read. So Katie, could we power through just real quickly, kind of look at what slides we have left? I know we have a few more. So the next one was.
Yeah. Oh, I put the wrong, sorry about that, guys. I put the wrong question, but the question was, what do you say to the, there's more strays on the street?
Right. So we have done data analysis and we're not seeing it. In fact, calls for service for strays have actually gone down. You can see there pretty remarkably 31%. Bite reports went down. Dead animal pickup calls went down. Aggressive stray calls went down. So we're always going to keep an eye on those numbers because those are a critical function of our organization. But our data is not showing that any of our actions have resulted in an increase in a public safety risk. Katie, if you could just move forward again, because I do want to get to that question because it's so perfect for Gina that we received. We talked about the rabies thing again, and folks, we're just going to skip this. It was in the FAQ document that you were able to review before this. We do not have a state mandated charter, which is a question that we received. We are municipal, locally ordinanced to do what we do. And then I'm going to end on this and we'll go to the question. What can you do to help? Gina said the word foster about 100 times, and she could have got on here and from 6 p.m. to 6:54 p.m., what it is right now, said the word foster over and over and over again, and she would have contributed to this because fostering is the answer. We need more fosters. There is a demand for people who want to foster around the country. We have not seen it at the level that I think some of the northern cities have seen. We are trying diligently to engage more people in fostering. Now, we had a big push in the spring, but it waned as people were going back to school and dealing with that. So foster, foster, foster. If you can't adopt, foster. We have transports going out all the time. You can foster a dog for 2 weeks. Huge. A 2-week fun time, have a foster dog, and he gets on a bus to Pittsburgh. It'll be great. Donations, of course, and you can also sign up to be a community outreach volunteer. One thing we know for sure is as we put more of our emphasis on these community-based efforts, we are going to need more than just paid staff, but we are going to need volunteers to help make these things a success. So those of you on audience today, please consider being involved. I know some of you already are, you're already volunteers, but please consider contributing in these ways. All right, well, that wraps our presentation. We have 5 minutes left, perfect time. We have a question that came in. Katie, would you mind reading that question? And I'm going to turn it to Gina.
Yes, I'm going to abbreviate it a little bit, but we had a question from Sarah. Just one of the biggest problems she runs into is that lost dogs don't have ID on them. And so suggestion about maybe us doing a coupon that would cover the cost of an ID tag. And part of that is because people that see a stray are more likely to stop if there is a collar. And obviously microchips are ideal, but only a small percentage of pets have them. So if we can substantially increase the number of dogs in the city who do have a collar and correct ID, we could lower the number of dogs who go to the shelter.
I'm giving that one to you, Gina. This is your whole world.
Well, it's true story.
Yeah.
What we need to do is shift the culture in this country. When I was a little kid, I'm old, there were no seat belts in the cars. Didn't wear them, right? What happened in America, all over the world, actually? Why did vehicle manufacturers start inserting, including seatbelts? It became a thing, right? And we paid a lot of attention to it. There was a lot of marketing around it. It was a constant conversation. That's what we need to be doing for pet identification. Because you're right. If I see a dog with a phone number on its neck, I'm not calling the shelter. I'm calling the phone number on the neck, or I'm texting it. I'm always encouraging shelters, and congrats on applying for that grant if I can help you in any way. Microchipping is critically important, keeping those chips currently registered, but it's reminding people that twice a year, like daylight savings time, that needs to be refreshed. If at all possible, any person that needs an ID tag with a phone number on it can get one free of charge at incredibly low cost. In Sacramento, when I got there in 2012 through 2018, in 2012, 10% of the cats and dogs coming into our shelter had some form of ID. And we launched this incredible effort to chip and tag everything free or low cost. And at the end of 2018, 42% of the animals coming into our shelter came in with identification. So it's a matter of shifting community culture. And it's something that I think all of us have to do. You know, does the website talk about it? Does our social media, are we always reinforcing that need? Until we do that, we won't change anything. So we'll put that on our list, right?
Yeah, for sure. Well, that brings us to the conclusion of our time today. I don't think that I could have had a better guest for tonight. Thank you, Gina. I think our conversation was fantastic. I'm so grateful to our audience today for tuning in and being a part of this. I look forward to working with all of you to implement the strategies we've talked about here. And certainly the great advice from Gina. Let's work together to get that return to owner rate up. I think it is absolutely the critical piece to the puzzle. Let's beat Austin. Let's beat them all. Let's make Memphis the #1 city in the country for return to owner for lost dogs and cats. So thank you all for tuning in today. Have a fantastic rest of your evening, and we'll see y'all real soon.
Thank you.